Thank you, Brad, and thank you all for being here today. So, as Brad mentioned, my portion today is on effective design, implementation, and construction management. So you've spent all the time and money to evaluate your roads, prepare your pavement management plan, budget your work, but it's important that you have a plan to effectively implement the design and then actively manage the construction. So I know there's a lot of construction experience in the room here, but I just want to discuss a few keys to keep in mind to get the most out of your roadway projects. So as Brad mentioned, I've been at EI for 14 years, mostly in the field, so before I get into it, I know everybody can appreciate all the fun things that happen on roadway construction projects, so I just wanted to give a shout out to a few of my favorites that we've seen over the years. You know, it seems like every year they never cease to amaze you how, no matter how many signs you have up, no matter how many cones you have up, somebody does something ridiculous. You know, you got the classic bike through wet cement, footprint in wet cement. We started putting up cones to try to keep people from driving into their driveways with the after prime, and you can see they kind of just disregard. And then my favorite though is that one down there on the left. We were reconstructing a road, had all the signs, they managed to get around all the barricades, and that's B618 depressed curb, so that's a 24-inch wide, 9-inch tall ribbon of concrete that tiny car managed to get all the way on top of. So I just thought you guys would all appreciate that. I'm sure you have your own stories, so I just wanted to touch on that before we get into it. Getting it off was the impressive part. So today's agenda, I'm going to try to hit a few key points along the entire process of the project, from pre-bid into pre-construction, and then a few aspects of construction, including flexibility, public outreach, having a plan, and then material testing and QA. So we're talking a lot about stretching your dollars. So, you know, what does that mean? Stretching your roadway dollars means no dollar goes to waste. You know, as Brad mentioned, the cost of materials is rising, 12.6% minimum. We see it every day. Costs are constantly going up. So it's essential that the dollars that we are spending are being used effectively and in a deliberate manner. Making every dollar counts achieved through effectively implementing the design and then actively managing the construction activity. And I like to think of myself when I'm out on a job kind of like Moneyball. You know, they set up the perfect design project, and I'm there to manage it to success. And this starts before construction even begins. So touching on a few pre-bid items, I like to have solid specs. You know, what does that mean? It eliminates contractor arguments, limits resident complaints, and then we tend to learn from past programs. So what did we argue about with the contractor last year? And then implement that in the spec for the following year. A few examples of these, when ADA sidewalk lowering or sidewalk reconstruction became part of all the design projects. You know, when you have to lower the sidewalk maybe a foot to make it compliant, where does that material go? Contractor might argue, hey, that's extra excavation. So including things like that in your spec limits arguments. We've started implementing timelines and penalties, so not just completion dates, but maybe midline completion dates on certain neighborhoods, or if there's schools along the way. Adding those kinds of things to your specs can help limit resident complaints. And then housekeeping standards, so making sure they don't have open holes on open curbs or open sidewalk for extended periods of time. I know that's fairly commonplace, but adding those into your specs and really holding the contractor accountable is important. And it helps move the job along as well. Also building in flexibility. So as Joe said, we like to add fluff. I'm not a huge fan of that term. I like it to be purposeful. So things that we see year to year that constantly get overrun. You know, restoration is one, that's a big one. You think you replace 30 feet of curb, you're gonna have 2 feet behind the curb that's gonna be replaced for restoration. Well, if you had to raise that curb up 6 inches, now you might need to go 6 feet or 10 feet beyond the curb for restoration, things that aren't obvious when you're designing sometimes. So adding fluff quantities for restoration, or seems like without fail when you're out there, you got 30 foot of curb marked out, you remove it, you go to replace it, you needed 5 more feet to get it to flow. You know, so having extra quantities for things like that goes a long way. And then same with ADA corners, having extra sidewalk accounted for to make sure that things are compliant in the field. Everything looks good on paper. You want to make sure that it'll work in the field. And then pre-bid, you want to have an effective bidding strategy. So you want to be bidding early. The earlier the better. February is better than May. March is better than July, things like that. You don't want to get out too early. You want to make sure that the kind of price increases have set in, or maybe decreases if we ever get lucky again. But you want the prices to be established for the following year. Get out to bid, you're going to get better prices. And then another bidding strategy, as Joe mentioned, that not all of our contracts require plans. So in the absence of plans, the more info you can include, the less ambiguity, the better pricing you're going to get. So some things, detailed information to consider, is the curb or sidewalk that you're going to replace accessible from the road. Like it's often overlooked. It's easy to just mark out sidewalk or curb on the plans to be replaced, but if the contractor can't reach it, they don't know that they have to bring out maybe a buggy to get the concrete there, or they don't know they have to have some sort of special truck to get the concrete there. That's going to be an argument. So you want to have as much information as possible, accurate information. That's going to get better pricing and less arguments from the contractor. And we found that contractors remember these challenges, so if you're constantly putting in things in your plans where contractor can't reach it, or it's a nightmare to do, they're going to remember those things, and you're going to see prices kind of bump up over the years. So the more information you can add, the better off you're going to be. And so now you've bid the project out, and you're kind of in the pre-construction phase, okay? So you want to, ideally you're able to inspect the roadways before the design. That's not always possible. Sometimes you're adding roads late. They're covered by snow. They're covered by leaves. So it's really important for the RE to perform a field review prior to construction. So they're going to go lay out all the removal limits accordingly. This is, again, when you don't have plans, this is especially important. And then oftentimes this is when residents give their input. A lot of times residents might not say anything, and then they start seeing arrows on the ground, mark out some sidewalk in front of their house. They're going to have questions. They're going to tell you where all the spots where it freezes in the winter that you might not know about, or where all the kids like to stand for the school bus that might need some sidewalk addressed. And then this is also your chance too to address anything that may have happened since the design was put in place. Over the winter you get snowplow damage, heaving due to freeze thaw, all sorts of things, utility repairs, things like that. So this is your time for the RE to really inspect everything and address everything. And then it's really important for your RE during layout to measure the quantities as they go. We like to make this a priority. That way you know from the start that you're starting on budget. If you lay out all the quantities and all of a sudden you're way over one of your quantities, you're in a bad way right away, so it's important to be able to adjust. And then we like to make sure too that the quantities make sense in the field, so doing things like laying out 30 feet of curb with a 5-foot piece that you're keeping and then another 30 feet of curb you're going to replace doesn't always make sense. Easier just to have one 65-foot long piece. You can get the drainage to work better that way. You're not trying to match in for these little pieces. And then sort of on the flip side, not doing all these repairs with 2-3 foot pieces of curb, making it 5-10 foot minimums. And then in pre-construction too, it's important for the RE to understand the scope and the intent. So with curb, are we fixing all the cracks as they mentioned before, or are you just fixing drainage issues? Are you just fixing all the sidewalk cracks or just trip hazards? Do you do partial driveway repairs or full driveway repairs? Having this scope in mind with the RE before they go out there to start market removal limits is important. If they think that if you're only replacing halves, you don't want to start replacing full driveways if you don't have to. I like to set a criteria and stay consistent. We often recommend written policies. That's helped us in the past. So if you have a written policy on which driveways get replaced or which curb gets replaced, it goes a really, really long way with the residents. When you say, hey, the policy is drainage issues and major failures. If you have a written policy that you can show a resident, oftentimes that limits the complaints from the resident. Then they know it's being applied consistently and that it's not like, why is Joe's driveway getting replaced and mine's not? You can clearly point to something to back yourself up. So after you've gone through your pre-bid items, your pre-construction items, you followed all the design best practices and you've created the perfect design project, and now your field work's about to start, and we all know everything goes perfectly in the field, right? And there's an example of a perfect field project right there. That car was 500 feet down a road that was removed because Google told them to go that way. And it took 2 tow trucks to get it out. So I'm sure you guys can all appreciate that. All right, so once you're in the field, a few things to keep in mind. Flexibility is key. Having the ability to add and subtract during construction is important based on your field observations. Being able to react in real time. So having all of your measurements completed prior to construction allows for quick reactions, and it eliminates downtime. So if you know right where your project is at all times, you can make quick reactions based on changing field conditions. Something that we try to do is have sort of our borderline areas in our back pocket. So if you know that all of a sudden something changes and you can keep maybe a piece of curb or some sidewalk you were expecting to get rid of, you'd have a borderline area in mind that you can right away mark out and get replaced. Or the flip side, if you're starting to go over those borderline areas that would be nice to replace but maybe aren't vital, you can start scaling back in those areas. Something else to be flexible in the field is we tend to try to do in a mill and evaluate strategy. Even if the pavement management plan says reconstruct or milling and resurfacing with heavy patching, some areas may have poor PCI or look like they need a lot of patching, but it's important to mill and then evaluate. So mill the area first, utilize proof rolls or your geotech sub if necessary, but there's no sense in doing work that doesn't need to be done. So this is especially important in patching. You want to make sure to replace any required deficiencies, even if it's only small areas, but don't feel the need to use all the quantity. So I've seen REs before where you have 1,000 square yards of patching on the job and they feel like they have to go mark out 1,000 square yards of patching. That's wasting your money. So only get what's necessary and don't feel the need to just use all of your quantity. So identifying patching needs prior to milling is an inexact science. Some roads look terrible before you mill it and look great afterwards. So just being prepared to adjust based on field conditions will produce the best end product and eliminate unnecessary spending. So similar to consistency during design, staying consistent with the scope and intent during construction is important. Oftentimes it's hard to know when to stop. So having a consistent scope is important. Remaining consistent with your pre-established criteria. If the scope of the project is street repair, we're focusing on roadway dollars. We try to only get essential ancillary items. Some villages do replace everything, which is, if you've got the money to do that, that's fine. But if you're focusing on stretching roadway dollars to improve your overall road system, only repairing essential sidewalk and then not deviating. If that's the plan, don't deviate. It's easy to kind of get in the mode of marking out every little crack and every little bump along the way, but you really want to get your major areas and not deviate while you're laying things out, and keep the focus on the roadway. And then something else with consistency is building a good reputation. This does not mean being a pushover by any stretch. You have a symbiotic relationship. You want to hold the contractor accountable, but we often try to avoid adding restrictions after the fact. If you don't allow steel forms, make sure you have that in the spec. Don't let them show up with steel forms and then tell them, hey, you can't use steel forms. Or avoid large deviations from planned work. Contractors tend to hate that. One, you're going to get a huge price if you're deviating, if you're trying to do extras. We all know how that goes. They can blow up in an instant. And we've seen with some of our programs, for instance in Schaumburg, where we're being consistent every year, you see those prices kind of go down or stay low every year. You're not seeing huge increases because they know they're going to show up. They're going to have a consistently run program with good design and good working relationships. An often overlooked part of construction is public outreach. You know, it's easy to forget, but the reason that we're doing all these projects is to better the community for the residents. And so taking care of as many problems as efficiently as possible is a good way to stretch your money, and you can do this with public outreach. Keeping the residents involved and informed allows the most efficient construction. The more proactive we can be, the greater chance the residents are going to be aware of what's happening, the greater response times we can get to their calls and their questions, the happier they're going to be. Why is this important? Well, it minimizes mobilizations by the contractor and subs. You know, there's nothing worse than you get through an entire street, then a resident calls, hey, my driveway needs to be fixed. You kind of evaluate it, yeah, it does. Now you have to do another mobilization for a concrete pour. Or you go to pave a street and there's a car parked on it. So having resident involvement in public outreach minimizes slowdowns, gets rid of those parking issues, gets rid of residents driving on prime. And you know, without fail, every time I show up on a street to do some sort of road work, there's a guy moving or there's a guy having a party, and you plan to mill, and now there's 40 cars parked on the street for a birthday party. You know, it seems to happen every year, and the more public outreach you can have, the less likely that's going to happen. And you know, the big plus to this is that you have less time investment by village staff. So if we're being proactive, if we're reaching out to residents, they're not calling, complaining, village staff isn't being brought in to deal with these problems. You guys can have your time free to go do other things where your time's being, time is more valuable. And also it gives a greater sense of satisfaction by the residents. So there's nothing better than doing a good job on a project. A person is happy with how it goes. They know their tax dollars are being spent wisely and they're not wasted. And what this does is you get a greater buy-in for future projects. So when you want to, raise taxes or do extra work or what have you, having other residents say, they do a great job out there. They really spend our money wisely. They're giving us a great product. It was very smooth. You get that greater buy-in for future construction. But no matter how well a project is planned, unexpected changes do occur. It's construction after all. So what do we do when things do not go as expected? It's important to have a plan and be prepared to pivot. So we like to do constant budget tracking. This gives a snapshot of the project budget on a daily basis and allows for real-time decision making. Is the project trending over or under? And does this allow for adjustments to be made not only on our program, but elsewhere in the village or in the municipality? So if you come to me and you have a water main job going on, you say, how's our budget looking on this road program? And I say, man, we got $30,000 that we're saving right now, projected to be under. That water main job they've got going on, if it's going a little bit over, you might breathe a little easier, not have to shift things around as much, have some extra money in your pocket. So it just allows for adjustments all over the municipality. And this is when it's important also to know your pavement management plan and then have plans in place. So if you are running over budget, which street are you going to cut first, or are you going to be able to do you have more room in your budget? So knowing that ahead of time is very important because ideally it's not needed. You have a perfectly designed program, but crazy things happen, and being prepared is your best idea. On the flip side of that, which streets can you add to a project if you have budget surpluses? So I understand with MFTs, this isn't always an option. You can't just add streets on an MFT job. But if you have locally funded projects, being prepared to add is important. We seem to do it often on a lot of projects. If you think about it, if you have a $3.5 million program and it comes 5% under, that's $175,000. So you can put it in your pocket, you can roll it over to the next program, but typically nothing is as cheap as it is that year. Everything's always going to go up. So if you can take that $175,000, apply it to another street, you're going to make your money go further. But having them in mind prior to construction avoids us trying to do a last-minute design in the field. It ensures all problems are addressed. We find that this is often a good time you have a dead-end street that's, terrible condition that you haven't had a chance to get to yet, or it's kind of not optimal as part of a project. You have an extra $50,000, get that extra street taken care of, get that dead-end street taken care of. Or in the project area, if you have a minor bike path that needs to be replaced, things like that, you can kind of tack on at the end and really make the most of your money. We found contractors typically appreciate the extra work, and so they're often willing to hold prices and add on that extra work for you. If conditions are tight, though, don't force it. You know, Murphy's Law seems to always apply. If you've got $50,000 and you're trying to do $45,000 worth of work, it seems to always end up being $60,000 at the end of the day. So don't force it, but if you've got extra money, being prepared to use it is a great strategy. And then something that's often overlooked as a strategy to stretch your roadway dollars is QA testing. So oftentimes, you know, we think of it as only minimal testing to ensure that you have the right materials, you know, maybe 25–30% of what the contractor's testing. But accounting for not only the minimum required testing, but additional testing is a good way to ensure that your materials are meeting spec, and not just, you know, eking over the specs, but making sure that they're really right there in the middle. So it's essentially, it's essential during late season paving, you know, if temps are dropping, making sure that your materials are in spec. Also, planning to have the QA sub out there for more than just, hey, drop a density test on the pavement and get going. No, look at it. Are the temperatures right? Are we just meeting spec? Do we need to make plant adjustments, recommending plant adjustments? All those things are often overlooked to get the best materials for the project. They can also be useful to evaluate the base and sub-base conditions if questions arise. And it's a good way to have backup information. So from time to time, you have come springtime, a road starts failing prematurely. Hey, why is that? Well, if you've got a lot of QA testing to kind of go back on and see, hey, were we meeting spec? Was it just meeting spec? Was everything good? Were there other things at play here that caused this road to fail? So small upfront investments in QA can definitely save you large investments in the future. So I just want to leave you with these points. You know, consistency is key. Consistency in intent, consistency in scope, consistency in strategy, and being consistent with your public outreach. Being flexible, so remembering to mill and evaluate and not use quantities unnecessarily. And then always having a plan, being able to adjust, and really actively managing your construction project. So I know I just threw a lot at you, so I open up for any questions, funny construction stories I always love hearing, anything of that nature. There's a perfect presentation.
All right, any questions for Kyle?
You have your solid restoration issues, and how do you typically handle restoration in the field to make it more effective? We seem to struggle every year with restoration. Either the side's bad or the cedar blanket didn't take, and you're just fighting every year. Do you have any strategies to make that better?
Nothing specific that I would lean on. I mean, we see that too for a lot of projects. I think being consistent with making sure that the contractors are not allowing weeds to grow, things like that, and then trying to just inform the public, getting a little bit of buy-in from the public, either watering or picking weeds or just themselves kind of keeping an eye on it can really help. I know the contractors are responsible for it, but the public giving a little extra watering, things like that, seems to go a long way to get sod to establish or grass to grow. And then just keeping consistent with the dates. A lot of times we tend to, not do anything and then do all of our sodding at the end of the year. So it can be frustrating because those people that had their street reconstructed in March and April, waiting till October to get sod is frustrating, but sometimes it means that the sod's going to grow better in the long run. So hopefully that helps.